Well, let's continue the conversation with our journalist this week. Tonda MacCharles is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star, Bill Curry, the Ottawa Deputy Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail, and Joanna Smith, the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Canadian Press. Hello to the three of you.
Hey there. Yeah.
So listen, Tonda, I'm going to get you to start us out here because we just heard Michelle Junot-Katsuya essentially say that CSIS gave warnings to successive governments and they ignored those warnings about China and potential interference. What's your reaction to that?
I mean, I think actually that we've heard the fact that CSIS has been giving warnings to governments for years. And in fact, I mean, back in 2010, we were hearing the same thing during the Harper government years. I think the fact that governments have been warned that there are potential concerns around, be it espionage or what have you, there are concerns that diplomats engage in things that are not always diplomatic, right? I think, you know, the more shocking thing that the ex-agent said was that 70% of the diplomats should be expelled and for spying. I mean, if CSIS has that kind of information and solid information that the government could act on, we might have expected to see some action. But look, it's a very delicate relationship. It's a relationship with a major global power that many, many businesses and sectors in Canada's economy do business with. So there are huge implications of a decision to expel diplomats. Mm-hmm. Now, we haven't expelled a Chinese diplomat since the 70s. So the fact that they've got one out, that's, you know, that was very interesting. But there weren't a lot of voices of opposition within the government. Everybody was just focused on, you know, doing it carefully to make sure there isn't escalating reprisals and blowback.
Okay, well, Joanna, I'll get you to pick up on that because, you know, you hinted a bit that we have this delicate relationship with China. Why ignore these warnings? If you're in government, you're hearing this from CSIS, why ignore it?
I think part of it, to pick up on Tonda was saying, was the global power and the trade relationships and what the business community wants to see. Everyone remembers, I think, who covers politics, back in 2006 when former Prime Minister Stephen Harper went to China on his first official visit. And he was rejected for a face-to-face meeting with the president because he refused to do it under the stipulation the conversation would only be about trade. And he famously said, we don't want, you know, Canadians don't want us to sort of heed to the almighty dollar. We saw that line of thought evolve over the rest of his tenure as Prime Minister, much more focus on trade. There was criticism for not speaking out on human rights. So, you know, he was sort of trying to contrast himself to the Team Canada approach of Chrétien and Martin. And then we saw, I think, some pragmatism seek in later on. And then I think back to, you know, the early days of Trudeau when they were talking about a free trade agreement, and they were trying to put human rights and gender and environment and labor into that. And China balked, and there was a sense that the Trudeau government was being naive and expecting these sorts of things too. So I think it is a delicate relationship. I understand the caution. I think we've just got to a point now where a lot of these things are becoming public, including things that are in fact very secret, becoming public, and there's a lot of pressure to do something about it finally.
But there's also, you can't ignore the fact that things have shifted in China. The regime that came in 2016 and under Xi Jinping changed over time, and so the relationship that governments have and the work that diplomats conduct changes over time given their marching orders. So it's not always been the same problem is what I would argue. And so I think that that's reflected in how some of the governments have to deal with this country.
Yeah, and in one way which this government is trying to deal with it, they're looking into a foreign agent registry, although according to La Presse and to Radio-Canada, that some bill will come out either before or after summer. So Bill, talk to us about this registry. How would it address, you know, Michelle Junot-Katsuya has talked about it a little bit before us, but how would it address the concerns being raised right now?
Well, I think it would be you know, a step that they could take. It doesn't answer all of the questions. For instance, this is a system that's already in place in Australia and the United States, and diplomats are exempt from that. So it's not going to tell you which consul general is, you know, which one's a spy. That's not what it's going to be. It's if you look at the U.S. database, which anybody can go online, it's quite interesting in terms of how detailed it is. It's even got things like Alberta's Canada Energy Office that lobbies in the United States on behalf of the energy sector. You know, that is a foreign agent. Canada, in this case, Alberta, operating in the United States. So that's the kind of thing that's there. It's also got a lot of people who are consultants, former politicians, former staffers. So people you would see on panel shows like this and elsewhere. former cabinet ministers, are they getting money from a foreign government? Well, in Canada, that's not immediately obvious. Now you could look it up. So it would be helpful for journalists when we're talking to sources, who's funding this person. Yep. Consumers of news, if they see somebody making a statement on TV, they can look it up. Who have they received money from? You can see the details. So it's an extra bit of transparency, but it doesn't really get at the question that we've had in the news the last few days about which diplomats are acting beyond a traditional diplomatic role and venturing into spying.
Yeah,
do you list anyone who is employed or paid by the Chinese government, or do you list anyone who's controlled or paid or doing any work or lobbying for a state-owned agency? And is it which countries? Mm-hmm. Is it every country that has any state-owned agency that has or enterprise that has people working on their behalf in this country? It's pretty complex. It's pretty fraught with all kinds of questions for, the drafter of that legislation.
Yeah, so again, we're now expecting it either before or after the summer break, so close eyes on that. But while you're here, I also want to talk to you in particular, Tonda, because earlier this week you wrote a report about an internal government document that essentially critiqued the response to the fall of Kabul, right, and getting Afghans who helped Canadian forces out of that country. And part of that report was essentially pointing a finger at government, that it was hard to get direction from government because essentially, this is how I read it, they were too concerned about the election that they called on the same day.
I mean, it doesn't expressly say that. What it does say, however, is it documents the very huge challenge of the government trying to coordinate all the responses that needed to be coordinated, both immigration measures, who do you let in, who can't you let in, the security screening of it, the D&D evacuation, what the soldiers on the ground in Kabul were doing, and foreign affairs interest in trying to deal with the diplomats and the embassy, and so it documented sort of the whole build-up from, say, the year before to the fall of Kabul, which was on election day, and how, frankly, to me, there was a big, I was shocked at how late everything did come together and how much chaos there was inside government about trying to pull these things together. And then once the election was called, I mean, you will all remember, like 2 days before the election was called, they rolled out new immigration measures to bring in Afghans. They had expanded a program beyond just locally engaged staff, which they announced in July, to all the interpreters and workers and contractors who'd helped. But in the end, it was a mad scramble on the day and the days after Kabul fell to get vulnerable people and people at risk out of Kabul. The election complicated, because you'll remember the whole first week of it was dominated by these questions and those pictures of people falling and chasing planes and falling off and, violence
mm-hmm.
at the airport. The election, the ministers were still minister even while the government was in a caretaker mode. And they were also constantly trying to deal with things. But there's no question it complicated the whole effort. And there was a very lack of a paper trail to document the decisions that the government was making on the fly and what was a valid decision, what wasn't. Now, looking back, it's sometimes hard to tell. There are lawsuits going on this very day to examine, who did have authority to put Canada's stamp on authorities to get out of Kabul and come into Canada. These are very litigious questions now. And, that report took a hard, cold look at how the government didn't anticipate early enough and how it responded on the fly.
Well, I remember when Kabul fell, and it was for days after. It was this: how do we cover an election all of a sudden when this real crisis is happening in Kabul? It seemed a bit insensitive, yeah, considering what people were going through on the ground.
And they were grilled every day, weren't they?
Yeah.
Just constantly.
Well, I was going to ask because you were here at the time.
Yeah, and I think it did feel a bit surreal and really dissonant, and I think that was ramped up by the fact that Canada had this presence there, right? There are global crises that are happening all the time during federal elections all the time. And this one struck because there was a clear sort of accountability line between Canada and responsibility there. And I think it's really also really impossible to separate it from some of the feelings of veterans and other people who had worked there, now feeling like their time there, which was obviously not easy for them, had been pointless, right? And maybe a sense of guilt for the people they had worked with, leaving them behind. So that sort of became part of the conversation. Speaking with all humility, I think a lot of journalists felt the same way, and were sort of involved in trying to reconcile that and work with that behind the scenes while also covering an election,
yes,
holding the government to account for actions involving our work, which is a complicated thing to navigate. And so that sort of brought it to the forefront in a way that other global crises may not have been. But yeah, when I read Tonda's story, like it just, that whole notion of them seeming caught off guard and the whole election forcing them into caretaker mode while also them recognizing how politically sensitive this was and how terribly afraid they were clearly of this running off the rails and ruining what they thought was going to be a good election for them was clearly at play. I think, you know, just from what I remember hearing at the time, the public service story, like, this is caretaker, this is what we do, and then the ministers sort of wading in and maybe some lines of what you could say when maybe got crossed without the support of the regular machinery of governance that's normally there, without caretaker mode. So it was just a very complicated time.
Yeah, and it was hard to delve into a political when it's like there should be, you know, covering this very human story. It's like, what do politics matter? There are people that are very much concerned for their well-being and their lives. You know, the image of the mother throwing her baby over the airport gate to try to save her baby. Bill, when you looked at Tonda's report, what went through your mind?
I was struck a bit by the recommendation, one of the recommendations, which is that the government should focus on situations that are not necessarily probable but high risk. And you would think, well, isn't that what we have a public service for? Like, this should be, you know, whether it's earthquakes or this kind of situation, you know, we need to have plans for things that may not be likely, but that could happen. And, you know, when that happens, then there should be a clear plan, because clearly, I mean, absolutely, it caught people off guard, not just Canada, elsewhere, but a lot of unusual things happen. I mean, our colleagues at the Globe have been writing about the situation with a senator, Marilyn McFedrin, who was just issuing all these pieces of paper to people,
what I was alluding to.
And you know, saying this is official government document, you can come to Canada, and they were not official documents.
Except that that's a point of contention, because they were so desperate to get people out. It did come from a chief of staff to the defense minister from Global Affairs. So really, I think a lot of people, that's the other thing, like a lot of people were making good faith efforts to try and get people out, right? But that chaos probably shouldn't be the norm. That's not tenable as a government operating procedure.
Yeah, but the result of which is that there are people that are stuck in limbo as to whether or not they should be coming to this country.
And actually, I mean, to Bill's point, you know, we have seen, again, the government caught off guard by events in Sudan, but most Western governments did not expect that clash to erupt as it did. And what I accept that maybe they were surprised, but what I don't accept is that, you know, one of the clear recommendations from this report was have a comms plan, talk to the public, let them know what our assets on the ground, our military soldiers are doing to get people out. We have not had that kind of transparency. We've had the odd briefing, but try and get an answer out of what the ships and the planes were doing at the fall of Sudan when people were being murdered in Khartoum. You know, we just didn't have, that lesson wasn't learned.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, too, that, I mean, right after that election, Harjit Sajjan was no longer defense minister. I mean, all those emails flowing through his office.
He wasn't reading his emails.
Yes, exactly.
Which we found out recently as well. Okay, well, thank you for that. That is the time for this weekend, but really appreciate it. So to Tonda and to Bill and to Joanna, thank you for the time today.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks.